Welcome back to another Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama review. Today we'll be taking a look at one of the most recent box set releases, which is of course a continuation of the 8th Doctor adventures starring Paul McGann in Ravenous 2, the second instalment of the Ravenous quadrilogy series that started earlier on this year, I do believe in around March or April time, which featured of course the 11 and the Candyman. Now, this whole series is in fact a continuation of the previous quadrilogy that Big Finish did do called Doom Coalition. It was pretty much a Time Lord versus Time Lord, massive universe space invasion type thing that was quite complex, definitely more for the Big Finish experienced listener. Ravenous, I like to think, is almost a little bit more of a relaxed version of that series, going in a slightly different direction, and something which so far I've been incredibly intrigued by. First off, and as always in the description below, I will leave the link to go and buy this release from the Big Finish website. It is of course currently out now. The physical edition is at the pre-order price of £23.99. However, after the December 21st, 2018, it does in fact go up to the normal recommended retail, I do believe, of around £30 to £35. To be honest, I can't quite believe we're looking at December already when it comes to pre-order prices. We're nearly at the end of 2018. Where has this year gone? I honestly do not know, but you can also get the download on the Big Finish website as well for £20, and I definitely recommend buying it now before it goes up in price, or even adding it to your Christmas list along with Ravenous 1, especially if you're an 8th Doctor fan, so you can save a little bit of money before it of course goes up in price in a few months. Also, if you are interested by what I say throughout this review, you can also check out all the story details, the casting information and the technical information on the Big Finish website as well, along with you can actually listen to the trailer for this release along with the previous releases in there also. Taking a close look of how this box set actually pans out, much like as per usual, this is a standard 4-pack box set where you have 4 separate stories, normally with an overarching theme running throughout. This time around you in fact have 3 writers taking the main controls. The first episode in this box set is Escape to Kadlor, written by Matt Fitton, and then episode 2 and 3 of this box set are in fact a 2-parter, both of which written by John Dorney, and it is in fact a Christmas special, which is quite a nice change, and it is in fact Better Watch Out, which is episode 1, and episode 2 of the 2-parter, which also doubles up as episode 3 of this box set, is The Fairy Tale of Salisbury. After the Christmas special, the series final for this box set is Seizure, written by Guy Adams, and nicely sort of wraps up the overarching plot elements of this series, and also leaves a few unanswered questions for the next box set, no doubt the box set after that as well. The box set is directed by Ken Bentley as per usual, and also the producer is David Richardson, script editor Ken Bentley, and then the executive producers are Jason Haig-Ellery and of course Nicholas Briggs as per usual. Taking a look at some of the characters that are seen throughout this story, it only of course makes sense to start off with the Doctor himself, the 8th Doctor, as portrayed by Paul McGann. Of course he is one of those Doctors that has really benefited from the Big Finish treatment, because in the TV show itself he only had Doctor Who the movie and more recently Night of the Doctor, and then Big Finish have managed to expand out his era to many singular releases with Lucy Miller and Charlie, and then we've gone to the Big Finish box sets as well, including Dark Eyes, Doom Coalition, and more so lately with Ravenous and the Time War series. And I think that the 8th Doctor throughout this box set is once again a really enjoyable Doctor. He has a few darker moments in there, kind of maybe suggesting that we're getting nearer and nearer to the Time War, where we do have a slightly different version of the 8th Doctor. And I like that he also has an innocent side as well. There is a few really nice moments throughout this box set, especially more so in the 2-parter in the very middle of this set, where you have him kind of taking his companions to see Christmas in Salisbury on the 5th of December, and he has some really nice moments with the relationship that he has with his almost family unit of companions, and you can tell that he cares about them quite a lot. And also in Seizure, the series finale for this box set, you see the 8th Doctor almost challenged a little bit, because you see them go to pretty much a decaying TARDIS, and because of the psychic energy that that TARDIS has, that of course puts a lot of strain on his mentality and his mind, and it causes him to basically have a massive headache. And you can definitely see a more angry version of the 8th Doctor that I'm hoping we see a lot more in the 8th Doctor Time War series, because I want to see this innocent, romantic, Edwardian Doctor almost pushed to his limits, because I'm confident, much like I've said in previous reviews, that the 8th Doctor could have very easily been the War Doctor. If anything, it might have been more effective to have this innocent Doctor being turned into the Warrior, but instead we of course got John Hurt. That still doesn't mean that the 8th Doctor doesn't of course get his share of Time War story stories as we see later on in his timeline. So yeah, I really do like Paul McGann for its box set, and once again, I think that all 4 of these adventures actually give you more reason to actually like him as a Doctor, because he just sounds so good on audio, his voice is so soothing, and Paul McGann is just simply brilliant. Taking a further look at the companions for this box set, of course the companions that we've had for quite a while, we have Nicola Walker as the infamous Liv Helen, somebody of which that was originally established in the Dark Eyes series, and I really do like Liv. I think that Nicola Walker does a really nice job with her character. Of course she is a med tech, therefore she has a lot of experience, and she is kind of a doctor in her own right. This series does in fact see a slightly more personal side to her character. Of course in episode 1 we have Escape to Kadlor, where we see her go back to her home planet of origin for the first ever time, of course also the home of the Vok robots as well, and you get to know a little bit more of her early life and a little bit more of her family issues, which is something of which I imagine if you are a fan of Liv as a companion, you will really like these stories for that reason. And if anything, I think that this box set actually answers a few of those questions from the past, and also opens up a few new ones as well that probably and most likely are going to get explored in further box sets. So if you're a fan of Liv, then this box set is certainly a must for you. And I think her relationship with the Earth Doctor is something of which once again is very enjoyable. Their relationship is very close and endearing, and yeah, generally I really like her. Moving on to Hattie Moran as of course Helen Sinclair, somebody of which that we later got introduced to in Doom Coalition, the Red Lady to be precise, and in previous box sets I have stated how Helen does seem to be a little bit underdeveloped. However, Ravenous has certainly seen a development within her character after the events of Doom Coalition, which I won't go into in this review. She had of course a relationship with the Time Lord Renegade the 11, and then we moved on from that in Ravenous 2. She's now back travelling with the Doctor and Liv, and I almost feel like this box set is her proving kind of her loyalty to the Doctor and Liv after the Doctor previously being a little bit cautious around her in the later half of Ravenous 1. And there is some excellent moments that Helen has throughout this box set. I actually think that this might be some of Helen's best work so far, especially the 2-parter in the very middle. There are certain aspects of that story that really nicely sort of summarise her character, and also in Seizure as well. You see her sort of reuniting with the 11 and the rather dodgy sort of relationship that they have, where both of them don't really get along with each other, even though the 11 kind of near enough was sort of really liking her in the earlier box sets, which is something that once again I won't really go into too much in this review because I kind of explained all that in Ravenous 1's review. But yeah, I like Helen. I think that she was a great character throughout this piece, and I certainly like her more so in Ravenous as opposed to her previous entries with Doom Coalition that almost seemed a little bit underdeveloped. Briefly going on to the other characters on this release, because we do have quite a big cast list, however I am only going to pick out the ones that kind of stand out to me. So naturally, Mark Bonnard as the 11, we all knew that one was coming if you see my Doctor reviews. He's an excellent character once again. We don't really see too much of him throughout this box set. We in fact only see him in the last episode of this box set called Seizure, which is okay considering that we kind of had a big massive story with him and the Candyman in the previous box set, which naturally I think that if you have to buy this one, chances are you've listened to the previous one anyway, so it is nice to have a gap from the 11 kind of being present in the series, because that certainly allows for a nice character development story with Liv. And then also the Christmas special in the very middle, which once again was absent of the 11, and I think that he is just a wonderful and very intriguing character, almost a Gallifreyan schizophrenic to an extent. Of course, if you are unaware, the 11 is this character that is essentially split into his 11 personas all at once, his 11 incarnations, and they all take over his body at different times, and all of them are very different people. And you have these brilliant moments that are excellently presented by Mark Bonnard, where he switches into the different personalities, and in this box set we certainly see a weaker version of the 11 where he is essentially asking for the Doctor's help, and Mark Bonnard really nicely delivers that scene in the very early half of this story. You do think that he is incredibly scared of the actual villain that is coming after him, so I think that he is a very believable character, and I really did like him throughout the story, the very little of what we actually had, so I'm guessing we'll probably see a bit more of him in the next one, considering the events of this box set kind of lead to him going on to do other things, which I will probably get onto later on in this review if I decide to go into them. And yeah, generally other than that, I'm not really going to mention the other people because I think that they do play some good parts, but once again, it's sort of a big cast list and I don't want to waste time going into that, so instead I'm just going to go on to the actual stories, starting off with episode 1, which is of course Escape to Kadlor, written by Matt Fitton. First episode of this box set basically sees Liv and Helen going going off to do a few leisure activities after the event of Ravenous 1. The Doctor kind of wants to give them a little bit of a break, and this offers for Liv and Helen to in fact have a really nice sit-down chat about their relationship, and kind of for the first time I actually realised that they in fact have quite a tight bond. I think that it is fair to say, something of which that I don't know why kind of went under the radar in the previous box sets, so I think that it is quite nice that we actually have a few minutes to kind of sit down with them. Of course we do go back to Liv's planet of origin, of course being the actual planet of Kadlor, where the robots of death come from as well, and we have this whole idea of an opening of a sort of shopping centre, and in this shopping centre we have the Vok robots and the dumb robots actually doing the different servant tasks, much like how they did do in the robots of death. And of course taking Liv back to the actual planet of Kadlor, naturally the Doctor does have a few alternative motives in there, because he sees that on the system there is somebody else called Chenka with the surname, and it turns out to be Liv's sister Chula, which she has not seen since the death of her father, which I do believe is something that may have been covered in a very early story from Liv's history, something of which I've not listened to as of yet, so no doubt if you're a fan, as I say, of Liv, you'll probably get a little bit more out of this story. But I do think that you know exactly what is coming throughout this episode, much like with any Robots of Death Vok robot story. You know that we are going to go to this place that all seems calm and peaceful, and then eventually the robots are in fact going to change slightly, and they're going to have different motives, and they're going to of course turn evil and start killing people. This episode is a little bit different because we see a slightly different version of Vok robot, which is in fact a little bit more humanoid and a little bit more personal, because we have Liv's sister Chula. She's in fact invented this new version of Vok robot, which in fact has more sort of natural speaking tones. It's not so robotic as we've seen in previous adventures, such as most recently the Sons of Kadlor, a series 7A story with the 4th Doctor. Those were much more of the natural Vok robots that we have seen in the Robots of Death. These ones are a lot more humanoid, they have a lot more nice flow of speech, and it makes them just a little bit more creepy, because the 8th Doctor needs to try and defeat the Vok robots throughout this episode, but also at the same time kind of defeat them by using logic and their own system, and by the fact that killing people necessarily doesn't give them what they want in the very end. And we have this whole sort of robot revolution type thing, and I must admit it is nice to have a rather basic storyline, and then that is accompanied by the fact that we have Liv's sort of family issues in there. The fact that Chula went off and didn't go to her father's funeral, she just kind of paid for it, so there is quite obviously a little bit of tension there. And at the very end of the story, Liv realises that she has a little bit to live for. Liv. But she has a little bit to live for on her own planet, and she in fact decides to stay behind, meaning that we see Liv's departure from the TARDIS. However, fear not, it's only for a year, and almost instantly the Doctor and Helen come back after a year away to pick up Liv at a certain designated spot in time or something like that, meaning that we do essentially have Liv's character having a year off camera, which I do believe is something that is going to be developed a little bit further in the future. I'm guessing that that might give this story a little bit more meaning, but for me personally it's a nice opening. It gives some nice development to Liv as a character, but it's nothing too special because it's a Robots of Death story with the Vok robots, and you naturally know what is going to happen. It is rather predictable, and at the end of the day the Doctor needs to sort of defeat them by using logic as per usual. And then moving on to the John Dorney two-parter of this box set, for me the gem in this set, because it is an episode that is set in Salzburg in Austria, and it is in fact a Christmas special, and I think that this is certainly the way to do a Christmas special, because it is set at Christmas in December, is in fact set on the 5th of December, and it is during something that I previously didn't actually know about, and it is Krampus night and St. Nicholas, and basically the Krampus is kind of a anti-bad version of Santa, and it's something of which that baffles me as to why the new series hasn't done it before. As for those of you that have seen my previous Doctor Who Christmas special reviews, you will of course know that I don't really look at Christmas special too fondly. I find them a little bit pointless, I find them cringy, I find them cheesy, and I just find them something that could quite easily be took out of Doctor Who canon completely, and it doesn't really have any effect on what actually occurs within the actual series. There is only a few Christmas specials that I actually like, but this box set in fact offers a Christmas special that is both yes, set at Christmas, but also has a very good narrative behind it as well. The idea about this episode is the idea of wishes, and we have basically the idea of Scrooge and somebody who is a landlord kind of upping the rent, and this causes quite a lot of poorer families to in fact be kicked out of their homes right near Christmas, and this leads on to one of the people of these families wishing to this mysterious figure. The idea about this episode is the idea of wishes, and we have basically the idea of Scrooge and somebody who is a landlord kind of upping the rent, and this causes quite a lot of poorer families to in fact be kicked out of their homes right near Christmas, and this leads on to one of the people of these families wishing to this mysterious figure. Krampus was in fact a real person and not just somebody from myth, and this whole story is based around that idea. And to start with, I love the opening moments to this story where we have the Doctor, Helen and Liv actually experiencing Christmas in Austria. It is a really lovely scene, sort of having them experiencing the certain aspects of Christmas in Austria, such as drinking sort of eggnog. And then also we have some brilliant sound design from Jamie Anderson and Benji Clifford as well, where we have a really nice mix of Christmas music, as well as really nice atmospheric stuff in there as well. I think that it's felt really warm. I think it was a lovely way that it was described in this episode, I think, by the Doctor, that Austria basically looks like the front of a biscuit box that you normally get at Christmas, where it all looks perfect and lovely. And I think that it's great that this lovely scenic sort of moment is then later ruined by the equivalent of the Christmas version of the devil come down from the skies and sort of scratch their way through the ground, and they are like these little gremlin characters that then know the truth and basically condemn everybody to hell. And we have these wonderful moments during the Krampus parade on Krampus night where these imps go up to a few people in the city, and one of them says something like, "Oh, have you been good?" but in this really cackly evil goblin voice. And then he just turns around and says, "Yes, of course I've been good." And the imp says, "That's not what you've been telling your wife and children when you return from her flat." And I just think that it's excellent because it's so dark, but also at the same time so very humorous. And there's some brilliant moments throughout this episode where the Doctor is in fact absent and observing the events of the story as they unfold. However, he's in fact coaxing a person down from committing suicide, and the whole episode in fact has these scenes broke out throughout it that basically have the Doctor explaining the story, and then eventually by the very end, of course, stopping this person committing suicide. That generally the character of Bruno, who is the person who did nearly commit suicide in the story, it is a really sort of hard-hitting moment, and I think that John Dorney certainly writes it incredibly well. We essentially start the episode with the suicide scene, which was a really nice choice. And if you are a new listener to Big Finish, then this may be a little bit of a daunting episode for you because it is quite complex. It does move all over the place. I in fact needed to listen to this release 2 times in order to fully understand it, and I think that it in fact benefits from that second listen. Of course, you know what eventually happens in the very end, but we have a few interruptions here and there that then lead on to the second story as well, episode 3 of the box set. And yeah, I think that generally it is a very timey-wimey one, but something of which that you can really respect because John Dorney has got this brilliant balance between having Christmas, then that's contrasted with the evil of this devil Krampus creature, and also this really lovely reality striking sort of suicide plot in. It's probably one of the best Christmas episodes I've ever seen. So yeah, I think that this is certainly up there with The Chimes of Midnight as one of the best Christmas episodes, and I certainly will be making time to sit down and listen to this one once more, nearer and closer to Christmas time. Moving on to episode 3, which is The Fairy Tale of Salzburg, which once again continues exactly the same narrative to the previous story. A few timey-wimey moments where we have a few people that once again are a poorer family that can't afford the rent. However, that scene from that part of the story crosses with the first opening moments to the previous episode, and you actually see almost the Doctor, Liv and Helen crossing paths with this slightly poorer family. And yeah, it's a nice sort of mix of different scenes sort of put together, and it is very cleverly written. And this episode, more importantly, is focused around a sort of Liv and Helen's relationship almost with the Doctor, because the Doctor is quite absent throughout the story, aside from the moments with Bruno when he's trying to coax him down from committing suicide, once again kind of presenting the story. I think that Paul McGann does a great job I must say, throughout this episode. He is a very warm Doctor, and he's sort of delivering, once again, this very dark plot, and I think that just works excellently with him. And I love the way that he presents stories as well. Certainly in the opening episode, there was this great moment where he says the tale of the krampus, where he mentions his father and a child, and the father introduces to the child the whole sort of myth of the krampus and them ending up being scared, and it's a really nice way to open the story. Once again, very fairy tale, which is very apt for the title. But this whole episode certainly challenges the relationship, especially with Helen, because Helen in this story, I must say, this is the main episode that really challenges her character, probably some of her best moments that I've seen so far in her different Big Finish stories that she's had, and it is slightly in a different way from what you expect. It does intertwine with episode 2, however, for some reason I just didn't see the twist coming, which on second listen I do think, how did I not notice what in fact happens? But I think at the same time, for that reason, it does work perfectly. And the closing act of this story, in fact, has a moment when you almost think that it is the end for this TARDIS team. However, of course, by the very end of this episode, it is recovered. After all, it is Christmas, and people do end up surviving, and you have almost this idea of Scrooge, and the guy that upped the rent at the very start of the story does in fact decide to tone the rent down a little bit in order to make it more affordable for the slightly poorer families. And the closing scene for this story, in fact, sees a very Christmas-themed figure actually sitting down to have Christmas dinner with the Doctor and this slightly poorer family, a little bit like the Christmas Invasion. Again, very atmospheric and relevant to the actual setting of this episode, and there's just something about it, considering that it's a dark plot. It has a great warmth to it, great characters, and for that reason, as I say, it is my favourite story from this release. It's simply because this two-parter is just so nice and brilliant, and offers some sci-fi but also some great character pieces in there too. Then moving on to the series finale, the closing episode for this box set, it is of course Seizure, written by Guy Adams, and this episode, as I said, features the return of the 11 and has a rather interesting episode because it is set within a decaying old TARDIS that has kind of gone past its sell-by date almost. It has been damaged and all of the insides are in fact turning within each other, and I actually think, come to think of it, that there was an episode in Doom Coalition that was also set entirely within a TARDIS, so I almost feel that this episode is almost taking a few elements of that one and kind of experimenting with them a little bit more. I think that in fact the previous episode may have been a battle TARDIS. I think that something like that occurred within the War Doctor series too. So I think that the TARDIS sort of theme, having a time travelling sort of capsule and then using the different dimensions within it, is a really interesting way to present the story. Of course, having the 11 in this episode as well is a nice way to introduce this episode. The opening scene with him is really daunting, as I previously mentioned. This episode is of course that it introduces properly the Ravenous, which is the main enemy, so we understand, for this series, considering that this quadrilogy is of course called Ravenous. Understand the Ravenous is basically a Gallifreyan myth creature from the Dark Times that feeds on the life energy from Time Lords. It basically uses the regeneration energy a little bit like a vampire and feeds from that, and also makes its victims, before it eventually kills them, kind of scared in order to release chemicals in its body to make them taste better. So it is incredibly sort of gothic horror, and the actual Ravenous, as seen on the front cover for this story, is incredibly creepy. Gothic horror, twisted clown that looks incredibly creepy, and you wouldn't want to bump into them in the middle of a dark woods in the middle of winter, because that is certainly what Liv has throughout the story, because she gets separated from the Doctor and Helen and eventually ends up meeting up with those, meaning that Liv is kind of left to fend for herself in this TARDIS, and she ends up meeting this other female character that turns out that the 11 has in fact killed when he eventually decided to steal this TARDIS before the episode took place. I think that Liv is almost pushed throughout the story, considering the previous one we had Helen being challenged. This one kind of flips that a little bit and sees Liv being challenged instead, which is very good. To think of it, I actually think that this episode is in fact rather well presented, because we have, of course, the idea of the 11 returning and then them being scared of the Ravenous within this TARDIS, and then you have the 8th Doctor being challenged because of the TARDIS's psychic ability, and you see both these Time Lords almost like coping with the idea of being in this TARDIS. It's almost having a breakdown. The Doctor Doctor is suffering, the 11 is almost used to it because he naturally all the time has 11 different personas in his head trying to get a word in constantly anyway, so he can kind of do what he wants. And you almost see these two different Time Lords and their different ways of confronting the situation. Of course, with the 11 being scared and not really caring about anybody but himself, he would rather the Doctor and Helen just leave the situation and leave Liv to basically die. Doctor, being the Doctor, does of course want to save Liv at the very end of the episode, which does of course happen as per usual. However, the main key element of this story, which I think isn't really going to be a spoiler to give away, Liv and Helen decide to land within this decaying TARDIS. The 11 then decides to steal the TARDIS key from the Doctor and basically runs off with the Doctor's TARDIS, and that is currently where we kind of leave this series on that note, where the 11 now has the Doctor's TARDIS, which is quite worrying, considering that we have seen previous stories where the 11 has had access to a TARDIS. It didn't really particularly end very well, so I'm wondering what the next box set is going to be about, and for that reason I do think that certainly the 11 is going to have a little bit more of a forefront, possibly throughout all four of these stories. And also the Doctor and his companions now basically need to move around the universe without the TARDIS, so that is going to be quite interesting. How are they going to resolve that one? I'm presuming that the next box set is probably going to be very confined to one certain location, or they're going to find sort of a dodgy second-hand way to do a little bit of time travel, which will be quite interesting. Maybe they're stranded somewhere. That would be quite cool, wouldn't it? Interesting to see where the next series leads. It does certainly have a few questions in there, but I think that Seizure, there's just something about it which is a little bit similar to the Doom Coalition series 1 and 2 finale, where it does have a lot of impact. However, I feel like it could have done something a bit more. I think that the running time for this episode is in fact rather small. It's only around 45 minutes long, so it's pretty much a new series story in its timing, which I don't think I've ever in fact experienced. This might be in fact one of the shortest actual episodes in the 8th Doctor era that I've listened to, which is rather unusual, but I do think that this episode almost could have done more. However, it didn't want to because it wants to save it for the next box set. So I think it is certainly a very nice sort of almost four-hander, but at the same time it didn't completely grab my attention. I should know a little bit more about the Ravenous as well first, because I feel like this episode almost leaves it still to quite a mystery, and I suppose that it's a little bit of that worry that was in Doom Coalition, where we had the opening box set that was fairly alright, then the second box set that kind of slumped a little bit, and then Doom Coalition 3 I like to think is kind of the duct tape box set, where it kind of ties up all the previous box sets and kind of fixes all the issues with them in time for the fourth one. And I've got a feeling that the next box set may be a similar thing to that. However, it's going to be more focused around the Ravenous, which I suppose will be quite good. I think that by this point in the series, Ravenous 3 won't include as much fixing up that Doom Coalition 3 needed to, because that one had a very big job to do. However, this one, I think that so far, Ravenous has been a very nice sort of stable adventure. It's had some great stories in there, and I think that generally it has been a rather nice romp so far, certainly a lot more controlled than the previous box sets, and I think that that is probably solely down to the fact that you have those singular stories in there as well that have absolutely no relevance to the plot arc, which if anything are probably some of the more stronger stories in this whole series, such as the Christmas special that I've previously reviewed in this video at episodes 2 and episodes 3. However, when the plot arc does come to the forefront, it's nothing too challenging, and Big Finish seem to be doing quite a good job at it. So I think that so far, compared to Doom Coalition and Ravenous, Ravenous is certainly doing a better job at presenting the plot arc, which is good. I'm glad that they've learnt from their mistakes that Doom Coalition had. So that is Ravenous 2. I hope you've enjoyed this review. Generally overall, with a little bit of a summary, I think that this is a nice box set to listen to, as I say, if you want more character development for both Liv and Helen, because this box set certainly offers that. Of course, the opening episode offers Liv a lot more time to kind of delve into her past, and then the Christmas special in the middle of this set, I think is kind of worth the asking price alone, to be honest. I think if you want a little bit more justice serving to the Christmas setting, then this is certainly a set for you. And also, if you are a fan of the 11 and kind of want to see him challenged a little bit more, then this is once again certainly a release that is worth considering. I find it odd always reviewing the 8th Doctor box sets, because I kind of feel like it is a niche community of fans where if you've collected Dark Eyes, for example, or Doom Coalition, you are always going to follow one and buy the next one, regardless of its content. It's almost like buying a book series series. Once you start it, you kind of need to see it all the way through to the end. And I think that if you are interested by Ravenous, I would certainly recommend starting off from Ravenous 1 and then working on that way, because I think it would be fair to say you could probably start Ravenous 1 without needing to listen to Doom Coalition, because that does have a lot of context in it. I feel like Ravenous is another jumping on point which you can do just with a few parts of the plot left a little bit open from the previous box set, but you could easily jump on, I think, if you kind of search for that context from the previous box sets. As long as you know kind of the basic premise, then you'll be fine. But yeah, generally overall, a nice box set, some nice adventures. By far, episode 2 and 3 are my favourite. I think that the final is a nice contribution. It's nice to finally get to know the Ravenous a little bit more, and also the opening one is a nice character development piece. And I guess that is that for this 8th Doctor review. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions about this release, then please do leave them in the description below, and I will reply to them at some point in the near future. And stay tuned for more Big Finish reviews in the future. I'm just checking now as to when the next 8th Doctor release will be. I do believe it'll be Time War 3, I think. Oh no, it'll be Ravenous 3 that is in fact out in April 2019. And then we also have the further adventures of Lucy Miller to look forward to as well. So yeah, lots of Paul McGann to look forward to in the future. And yeah, I'll see you all in more Doctor Who content in the near future as well. So yeah, thanks for watching. I shall see you all next time. Bye for now.